Welcome back to Minnesota Matters. I'm Scott Peterson. The Replacements are a now more or less defunct Minnesota band whose music runs the gamut from loud, obnoxious, fast, and profane to insightful, thoughtful, pretty, and profound. It's been a long time since the group's peak in the 80s, yet their music has stood the test of time, and through the years, their legend has only grown. Their whole story is told in vivid detail in a new band biography called Trouble Boys from author Bob Mehr. I recently asked Bob what compelled him to write the book.
Well, first and foremost, I was a fan of the music and a fan of the band for many years and had read all kinds of things about the magazine stories, and there've been attempts to kind of tell their story in some books, anthology-type things, and also in oral history. But I felt like the version of the story, of the Replacement story that was out there, was a story that was told from the outside looking in, and I wanted to tell it from the inside. And I also felt that there was so much about the band that was almost presented as myth or legend or caricature in some cases of who and what they were, and I felt like all that was just sort of surface, and so I really wanted to dig in and do the research and the due diligence to kind of try and understand the band internally, in a sense, and the lives they led as people and the career they had as a group.
And as far as telling the story from the inside, you did have access to Paul Westerberg and Tommy Stinson, as well as others close to the group during the course of their career together. How did you get that access?
Well, I'd like to think it was, just my charm and good looks, but it was a matter of a couple years' effort to court them and to explain to them why I felt it was important that they have a real definitive history out there for themselves and kind of for the record. So I presented, different ways. I met with Tommy out in California, had dinner with him. I proposed it to Paul more formally, and I had relationships with them as a journalist, having interviewed them over the years, and tried to develop a relationship really to make them understand and see why it was a good book and why it would be a good effort for them to be a part of. And yet at the same time, even though they participate, they didn't really, it's not an authorized book. It's more of, their participation, their involvement, but my story or my ability to tell their story. So that having those lines be very clear was important because it's a tough story in a lot of ways, and maybe the inclination of most bands and most artists would be to pull some punches or shade some things a certain way. And I felt like to do the story, any kind of service, you'd have to tell the truth.
For those of our listeners out there that maybe aren't familiar with the band, this may be a difficult thing to do since you spent so many years
right.
on this. What would you say to those folks if you were going to give them a sort of capsule description of what the band is and why it's important all these years after they broke up?
Well, the Replacements were a band from Minneapolis, started in 1979, broke up at least in their original incarnation in 1991. So they're really kind of a band of the 80s. They put out 8 records. Half of them were on Twin Tone, a local Minneapolis label, and half were for the Warner Brothers Sire labels. And really, they are considered, I think, generally in people's hearts and in critics' minds as one of the most beloved, important, and influential bands from that period. That's and Paul Westerberg, their singer-songwriter, one of the great songsmiths of his era and sort of voice of a generation in his own way. And that's one part of it. Of course, they're revered and regarded and wrapped in so much romance because of their wild antics and all these stories you hear about their shows and the way they performed and lived and all that sort of stuff. So it's a combination of factors that I think make them a really compelling story and an important Minnesota story, too.
And you call the book Trouble Boys, and that's not a coincidence. Maybe if you could tell me what it is about that title and what its origin is that you chose that to be the name of the book.
Well, it's actually the name of a Dave Edmunds song or a Billy Bremner song done by Dave Edmunds, and it was one of the first songs that the band, the early Replacements, really kind of came together on. They found their sound rehearsing in the first few months, playing that song, and so it was a little bit of a flashpoint moment. And of course, I like the double meaning. The Replacements were a fairly troublesome group, mostly for their managers and their record label and people in the music industry. They were very willful and headstrong and did some things or didn't do other things things that were kind of went against the grain of the traditional music business approach. So it had Trouble Boys had a double meaning, and in some ways a triple meaning, because they came personally from somewhat troubled backgrounds. So it seemed like it had multiple layers there that made it an ideal title for the book.
And you alluded to this just a moment or so ago, but how much of an impact was their location, or coming from Minnesota, how much of an impact did that have on them being Trouble Boys and being the group that they were?
Oh, I think the thing about the Replacements is so much of who they were and what they were came out in the band and in their music. So it's almost inseparable in terms of the geographic, the socioeconomic, the time period that they came up in. These were folks that were children of World War II veterans or coming out of that post-war era. It's a much different time. They were mostly blue-collar, mostly Catholic, very Minnesotan. And so all those factors, I think, were essential to who they were and how they sounded, and the way they approached their career, too, to a great extent. So all that's very much wrapped in that regional identity into their career and to their music.
And I hope I'm not oversimplifying here, but of course you've addressed some of these issues. You know, they're highly regarded by fans and critics. They seem to forever be the band that was due for the big time, didn't quite get there, and a lot of the myth of the Replacements has to do with their sort of self-destructive streak and nature. You know, there's a point in the book when Paul Westerberg breaks one of his prized guitars, and he says to one of the Replacements' close associates, you know, "You cherish things that you love, me, I destroy them." That's a recurring theme in the book here. What sort of insight do you have into that, what appears to be self-destructive streak?
Well, you know, a lot of it was based on a kind of fear, a fear of failure, as well as a fear of success, and all those things, I think, go back. I mean, these are complex issues that were in some ways very personal, and what I tried to do with the book was explore that. You know, I suppose the insight that I have is that it wasn't as simple as has been presented. I mean, everybody tends to look at, or many people certainly tend to look at the Replacements' failure to sort of succeed on a grand commercial scale during their career as down to their own kind of rebellion and self-sabotage. But I think there were more complex factors than that. I mean, some of it had to do with addiction, some of it had to do with psychological stuff, some of it had to do with a fear, you know, that was rooted in some very deep and dark places. So I try and explore that and break that down. But, you know, the simple answer is that there's no simple answer for why they did what they did, and hopefully the book tries to present the bigger picture and the bigger view of all that.
I would say one of the things about the book that struck me most was the story and the detail paid to Bob Stinson, of course, the founding guitarist of the band. Just give me your sense of his story.
Sure. I mean, it is a tragic story in a sense, but I feel also a kind of a triumphant one, you know, in terms of what he did with his life and the music he made and this legacy that he created that still is there today. He was in some ways a product of a very difficult home environment and some abuse, which led to some of his addictions and issues, but also led to the creation of the Replacements. He spent a lot of time in the Minnesota State Juvenile System as a teenager, you know, Red Wing and other facilities, and then group home. And when he came back out of that, for Bob, music was the way to reconnect with the world and to sort of find his place in this world that had been very troubling for him as a kid. And that impulse, that drive to make music his life, and also bring his younger brother Tommy into that same world, really is at the heart of the Replacements story and carries through so much of their tale, even after he was out of the band, of course, and then leading up to his tragic death, you know, at the age of 35 in 1995. So it's you know, for me, it's a sad story. In talking to his family and researching his tale and those lost years as a teenager, it's a tough story to tell, and I felt a great responsibility to tell it accurately, because one of the things I felt was that Bob was too often portrayed as you know, wild and crazy without really giving any kind of understanding into what made him that way and why things played out the way they did in his life. And, so I wanted to give some humanity back to Bob and some complexity back to our understanding of him.
Another revelation for me, in spite of his brilliance as a songwriter and frontman for the band, there are times throughout the book when Paul Westerberg seems like not the type of guy you'd necessarily want to be friends with. Do you think he's mellowed with age?
Oh, certainly. I mean, most of the stuff that's documented in the book happened, at a point where Paul was in his 20s and the rest of the band was in their 20s, or in Tommy's case, even younger than that. So I think the typical follies of youth and again, sort of being driven by certain fears and neuroses about success and failure and where you belong in the world. I mean, the thing about the Replacements was these were not outward, outgoing people who were comfortable and their first home was the stage. I mean, they got on the stage. Paul even says it. He's like, I'm the last person you would have thought I would be on a stage, and yet there he was. But I think they all had a drive to express themselves creatively, to make something of themselves, and really to kind of avoid a life that would not have been really great probably for any of them had it not been for the band. I mean, the first part of the book is called Jail, Death, or Janitor, and that's Westerberg's feeling. Those were his options in life had the Replacements not come along, Jail, Death, or Janitor. And so I think there was a drive and an ambition there, propelling the band that a lot of groups didn't have. I mean, it was in some ways life or death for them. Sadly, in Bob's case, it became, his passing fairly young. But the fact that they got as far as they did during their time is remarkable. And of course, the happy note in some ways is that here we are, 35, 36 years later, talking about them, and on their recent reunion, the Replacements are playing to 14,000 people in baseball and tennis stadiums in Minneapolis and New York and all these places. So a story that might have been, tragic, it really is triumphant in the end.
And I wanted to ask you about their hometown show here in Midway that Paul and Tommy played as the Replacements, I think a little over a year ago. Were you there for that show, and do you have any insight or perspective into what it may have been like for them to play in their hometown?
Oh, yeah, I was there, and I think, you always have maybe a difficult or weird relationship playing in front of your hometown for many, many reasons, but I think for them, playing in Minneapolis at that point, they'd been doing the reunion maybe a year, and that was their first headlining show. Most of the shows had been part of, bigger festival bills. To come home and fill a baseball stadium and to have so many people out there, partying and tailgating in the parking lot, and it was the last show, obviously, at Midway, at the old Midway, and I think it was such a validation. The end of the show, Paul and Tommy really embraced, and it was such a genuine moment and a powerful moment to see. For me, I think as difficult as the Replacements' history has been, as sometimes tortured as it's been, and in some ways for both Paul and Tommy especially, having that legacy, it can be a millstone around your neck, but to see them embrace it, and literally and figuratively on stage in the Twin Cities was pretty remarkable, and I think that's basically in some ways where the book ends on that note.
And, we are here 35, 36 years later still talking about them. I think the primary reason for that is the songs. What is it about the songs that resonates with those of us who care and still listen all these years later?
I think, with Paul, it's a mix of things. I mean, naturally a gifted wordsmith, and it's a kind of, he plays with words and plays with imagery in a really beautiful way. But I think even more than that, there's an emotionalism that comes out in his songs that probably doesn't come out anywhere else. And so there's a tremendous impact there. I mean, he says it himself. He would sort of mine his feelings for his songs, and I think, you get a sense of that. His music and those songs, particularly the ones he was writing in the kind of peak period between, say, 84 and 87, and really throughout his career, but in terms of Replacement songs, they connected with people on different levels. It was head music, it was heart music, it was gut music, it was all those things, and I think that's why those songs have lasted and become, anthems and classics in their own right, for not just for his generation, but for successive generations.
All right, Bob. Well, thanks so much for writing the book and sharing the story. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on, Scott. I appreciate it.